Among the leading authorities, for those of you who follow the field, would surely have been, back then, Brownlee, Jennings, and Bowers. All three of them agreed, there was a consensus, that even in a war of self-defense, a country is not entitled to acquire territory. I'll just quote Jennings, who wrote one of the main studies at the time, in 1963. He said it would be a curious law of self-defense that permitted the defender in the course of his defense to seize and keep the resources and territory of the attacker. The recent scholarly opinion concurs, even if it is a war of self-defense, it's inadmissible to acquire territory. The main scholarly study is by this woman, Corman, but here I'll quote the other person on the panel this evening, namely Professor Dugard. I guess it was his Cambridge lectures, and in the course of them he addresses this particular issue, and he says as follows: the United Nations expressly refuses to accept the argument that territory may be permanently acquired as a result of action taken in lawful self-defense. Large majorities in the General Assembly in support of this principle, namely you can't acquire territory by war, even if it's self-defense, and the failure of any major power to veto it in the Security Council must surely provide evidence that this principle, that this principle is part of the international public order and by implication a peremptory norm.
From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free. From the river to the sea, Israel will be free.
Some like
the issue of the question, the issue of acquiring territory by war, it came up repeatedly after the June 1967 war. It first came up at the fifth emergency session of the UN General Assembly, and I'm quoting the Secretary General at the time, Bhutan. He said that there is near unanimity in the General Assembly regarding the withdrawal of the armed forces from the territory of neighboring Arab states, because everyone agrees that there should be no territorial gains by military conquest. During the fifth emergency session, there were many resolutions put forth in trying to resolve the conflict. Every one of those resolutions that was put to a vote, every one included as a clause that Israel had to fully withdraw from the territories it conquered. The only debate in the General Assembly was whether the neighboring Arab states had to recognize Israel and terminate its belligerency simultaneously. But there was no debate whatsoever in the General Assembly as far back as July 1967 on the principle that Israel had to fully withdraw. Again, the only country in the world that registered any dissent from the principle of full withdrawal was the United States. Was Israel. If you go back and look at the record, Arthur Goldberg, speaking in the General Assembly, was very clear. One component of the settlement had to be a full Israeli withdrawal to the June 4, 1967 border. As most of you know, again, the issue came up in the Security Council in November 1967 when the UN General Security Council Resolution 242 was passed, with the famous preambular paragraph stating that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. There are 15 members of the Security Council. 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council, either during the Security Council deliberations or during the General Assembly deliberations, 14 of the 15 explicitly endorsed the principle of full withdrawal. The only exception was nationalist China, which at the time was having its credentials challenged and didn't participate in debate. The U.S., again, it officially adhered to the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquiring of territory by war, allowing for the exception of minor and mutual land swaps, to which I'll return later. In 1970, the United Nations General Assembly, by acclamation, passed the Declaration of Principles of International Law, in which it stated, and I'm quoting, "The territory of a state shall not be the object of acquisition by another state resulting from the threat or use of force." Notice it doesn't specify aggressive, self-defense. You cannot acquire territory by force under international law. Well, what does the recent record look like? The recent record actually is remarkably unambiguous. Everybody in this room who Googles the back of the room, although I doubt they're Googling ICJ opinions or UN General Assembly resolutions, all you have to do is Google the words peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Every year, that resolution comes up before the United Nations General Assembly. And that resolution, among the tenets for achieving a peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine, it includes these: affirming the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, affirming the illegality of the Israeli settlements, stressing the withdrawal of Israel from the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, and stressing the UN Resolution 194 for resolving the refugee question. Those are the tenets. What is the vote? You can check for yourself. It's quite illuminating. I'll go through quickly the last 10 years. 1997, 155 to 2. 1998, 154 to 2. 1999, 149 to 2. Skipping a little, 2002, 160 to 4. 2005, 156 to 6. 2007, 161 to 7. The votes are always the same, and the dissents are always the same. The whole world on one side, and the other side, the United States, Israel, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. That's it. The whole world on one side, those major powers in the Pacific on the other. And that now brings us to the current state, namely the most recent addition to the record, namely the ICJ opinion in 2004. In the opinion, it begins by laying out what it calls the rules and principles of international law which are relevant in assessing the legality of the measures taken by Israel. And it lists these rules and principles. 1. No territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal. 2. The policy and practices of Israel in establishing the settlements in the Palestinian and other Arab territories acquired since 1967 has no legal validity. And then at the end of the opinion, it ran through the its findings. I won't detain you with them now, except to point out it reiterated these principles in the context